Jonathan Hinder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State has repeatedly told us that he feels uncomfortable and uneasy. If I'm being totally honest, I don't think he believes this is right at all. I think in his heart, he knows this is wrong. Of course it is wrong. Stopping an 11-year-old, a primary school child, from going through the natural process that we all must go through to become adults by injecting them with drugs. It is wrong. Look at that screen. Puberty suppression. Think about those words. Suppression of puberty. You don't need a medical degree or a science degree to know that it is wrong. This is a moral question, and I'm afraid the Secretary of State is on the wrong side of it as it stands. He says, let them be. If only they had let Kira Bell be, who had these treatments much older than these children are going to be given it, and regrets it all, and now campaigns to stop this. There is huge public opposition to this.
I assume the honourable gentleman is getting to a question.
There is huge public opposition to this. There is huge opposition to this amongst people who vote Labour, including so many of my constituents. So I implore...
The honourable gentleman's question is far too long. Secretary of State.
I would say to my honourable friend, who, despite our different conclusion on this matter, I respect, that part of taking decisions as Health Secretary involves sometimes approaching issues where, on a personal level, one might feel uncomfortable, but nonetheless being guided by the right principles to take decisions for other groups of people in this country and for the country as a whole. And I'm not in any way disputing how difficult a matter this is, but it is one where I, as Health Secretary and predecessors before me, have had to carefully consider how we make sure that the clinical basis for any future decisions is robust and one that we can point to as a foundation of where this matter settles. The situation before Dr. Cass did her review, the situation in the Tavistock Clinic that the honourable gentleman opposite recognised was totally unacceptable, and we must never go back to a situation where it is out of control in the way it was then. But in working out how to move forward, I believe that as uncomfortable as it may make myself and others feel on an individual basis, focusing on the principle of following clinical evidence and demanding the highest possible safeguards for children involved, the highest possible protections for them, set objective criteria for them to be withdrawn or for action to be taken if the risk of harm increases, that is the balanced, correct way to proceed.
Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. He mentions following the advice of clinical experts, but has he sought any meetings with whistleblowers, former clinicians at the now closed Tavistock Clinic, detransitioners and psychologists like James Esses, Marcus and Sue Evans, all campaigning to stop this trial and the testing of children as young as 11 years old, too young to even access social media, and certainly not to give meaningful consent to taking banned drugs?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can reassure the Honourable Lady, as I set out in my responses to earlier questions during this statement, that whilst my starting point is that clinical evidence should be the basis of our way forward, I have taken the responsibility to interrogate that with the highest level of scrutiny myself to make sure that the conclusions are as robust as possible. And that has involved me making sure that my clinical advisors at the Department for Health and Social Care and the other bodies associated with the department have had to provide me with the highest level of detail and reassurance about the safeguards which were in place. Because although the principle of following clinical advice and basing conclusions on clinical evidence is one that I stand behind, I feel it is important for me as Health Secretary. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Dr Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I declare an interest as an NHS consultant paediatrician and a member of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. So what does this trial do? Put simply, it takes physically healthy children with normal pubertal development and subjects them to powerful drugs which may weaken their bones, affect their ability to think, damage sexual function, and make them unable to have children of their own. Serious stuff. For what? To treat a diagnosis of gender incongruence that will probably resolve without treatment. Let's look at it carefully. Gender incongruence is a subjective condition, how someone says they feel. There are no lab markers and no scans. Now that, of course, is not necessarily unusual. In fact, it's common in mental health conditions. Gender incongruence is often self-resolving. It gets better on its own. Again, not unusual in paediatrics. It's really common for children to be admitted to hospital for supported care for things like gastroenteritis and respiratory viruses. Puberty blockers are powerful drugs, powerful treatment with significant long-term consequences. Again, not new to paediatrics. Some chemotherapy, for example, has substantial short and long-term consequences. But what is unusual, and I think toxic, is the combination of all three. Medicine is about balancing risk. Where else would we give powerful drugs with potentially serious long-term consequences for a subjective condition which is likely to get better on its own? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I understand this trial has been approved, but time and again we have seen and heard how fear and hostility can distort priorities. We have seen tragedy occur when fears of accusations of racism limited mental health treatment. We have seen profound suffering when fear of accusations of Islamophobia limited inquiries into the grooming gangs. The healthcare of children distressed about their gender is another topic where there have been attempts to shut down debate with threat and accusations of transphobia. Such reports were reported after the Tavistock. When considering treatments with lifelong implications, we have a duty to be careful and sensible. So I ask the Secretary of State, why is this government funding a trial which will cause harm to physically healthy children? These children may be 11 years old. Tanner stage 2. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are primary school children, some of them, with only minimal signs of puberty. Far too young. The MHRA warned in February that the youngest patients are at greatest risk and may end up on puberty blockers for a much longer period, with a higher risk to fertility because sperm and eggs have not yet fully developed at Tanner stage 2. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm reminded of this point in the judgment in Bell versus Tavistock. There is no age-appropriate way to explain to many of these children what losing their fertility or full sexual function may mean to them in later years. Yet, as the Secretary of State confirmed, the children themselves must consent or assent to being in the trial. Why did they not heed the MHRA's recommendation of a minimum of 14 years? This Labour government thinks 14 is too young to watch social media. Why does it think 11 is old enough for this trial? What is the goal of treatment? In the trial, the outcome is the short to medium-term effect of quality of life and body satisfaction. Does the Secretary of State believe this is proportionate to the risks of these medications? Is there any evidence suggesting puberty blockers are safer than they were thought to be in 2024, when the government banned them following the expert advice from the Commission of Human Medicines? Some have suggested that the drugs help adults to pass as the opposite sex. Is the long-term damage really worth it for the cosmetic benefit of a few? And speaking of a few, it is a few, because we know that the vast majority will be better without any treatment. Madam Deputy Speaker, he said, when it comes to eligibility, we're talking about a very small subset of a very small pool. Even if we were to accept the premise that a very, very small number might benefit from treatment, how could the clinicians identify which those children might be? There is a study of clinical outcomes from kids treated at the Tavistock due to be completed next year. That could help. So why is the Secretary of State not waiting until that report is completed before conducting an experiment on an unnecessarily broad group of children? Has evidence come to light since the CAS review which helps clinicians to confidently work out which 11-year-olds will become adults with gender dysphoria and which will not? The Secretary of State also said the criteria will stop short-term harm, and this means any long-term harm should not occur or go unnoticed. But history is littered with examples of things which do not cause short-term harm, but do cause long-term damage. The Secretary of State also suggested that this trial will resolve the dispute. But sadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't think this will be the case, because firstly, a single trial alone rarely does resolve a dispute. And secondly, the comparison group that are not getting the puberty blockers are not randomised and are an intrinsically different population. This is something bound to be highlighted once the result is published. In medicine, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have a founding principle, primum non nocere, first do no harm. So can I say to the Health Secretary, please cancel this trial before vulnerable children suffer unnecessary, irreversible harm on his watch.